I want to wish happy Eid to everybody out there who celebrates. It's not happy, of course, for Palestinians living in Gaza or the West Bank, who at last count were looking at death tolls topping 37,000 in Gaza alone and uncounted numbers under rubble. The UN, the UNHCR, organizations of international human rights and aid have really run out of language to talk about the sort of catastrophic conditions for life in Gaza. And we're seeing governments around the world under increasing assault from their nonviolent assault from their voters, from their public, and even increasingly to some extent from people within their own workforces. I want to suggest that our guest, Josh Paul, who quit the State Department after a long career there, working in the Department of Military Affairs, who quit last fall in October, his decision to leave his post played a big role in inspiring people to take personally the role they were playing in this disaster, in what the highest international court in the world has called a genocide. So I want to thank Josh first and foremost for his courage and his visibility. And since we first spoke soon after you made that decision, Josh, we've seen people in our midst, in our circles, in our communities, do everything from decide to quit, to voting uncommitted, to protesting on their campuses, to raising money for aid and relief, to calling for prosecutions, to legislating or attempting to legislate. And we're going to talk about all of these means for taking action tonight, because while we can say a lot of things on public television, we can't actually tell people what to do. And we're not going to tell you what to do tonight, but we do believe that there needs to be greater clarity about where public pressure can usefully be applied even now, what the law actually is. And we are incredibly lucky and honored to have you. And I also see some other experts in our midst here tonight who will fill us in on some other developments as the night progresses. This is a chance for all of you out there to ask questions of Josh Paul and me and anyone else who speaks. We are going to ask you to use that digital hand raise tool. It's simply easier for us to see. If you want to pose a question in the chat, we will catch that too. But let's kick off, Josh. I start a lot of our conversations by asking how people are feeling, in a sense, what's uppermost in your mind and top of your heart. And I'm going to start that with you tonight. I'm sitting in a little studio in upstate New York, sweltering hot, and thinking about Palestinians right now in refugee camps, having moved a gazillion times in temperatures that I heard recently were topping 120, 130 degrees. So I'm not complaining, but I am sweating and I am heavy of heart. What about you?
Thanks, Laura. And before I even answer that, let me just say what a pleasure it is to be speaking with you again and with your team. Our conversation, as you say, that we had pretty soon after I first left the State Department, was really one of the first sort of in-depth conversations that I had the opportunity to have. In this modern media environment, we have, these sort of 5-minute max interviews where you can just sort of hit a couple of top lines. And I really appreciated the opportunity then, as I do now, to dive into these topics in some greater depth because, they deserve a lot more than 5 minutes of our time. So yeah, I mean, I think we're 8 months into this, and as you have said, the catastrophe is enormous. The death toll is enormous. The amount of injuries and wounded, and of course, those who have died now from malnutrition or from preventable diseases or chronic conditions, the devastation of the infrastructure in Gaza, the hospitals, the schools, the electricity, the water, all of this. And combined with it, of course, the expanding disaster that is happening in the West Bank, which we should not take our eyes off. And the calamity this has been, let's be honest, both for the regular people of Israel and for American interests around the world. It just leaves one feeling, with a heavy heart. And, I think fair to say on behalf of many of us who have been trying to push back on this over the last few months, quite frustrated. Um, that said, I think there have certainly been hopeful signs in the past few months, particularly here in the United States, where we have seen an unprecedented upswelling
Yeah.
of calls for a change in American policy. If you had said to anyone a year ago, the number one issue of this generation in college will be Palestine, no one would have believed you. And yet I think we have seen now protests that will mark and scar and shape a
Yeah.
generation, along with the Uncommitted movement that has seen hundreds of thousands of Americans voting in their primaries uncommitted. So I think there are some positive signs.
Yeah.
I think we have to remember that this is going to be a marathon and not a sprint, and it is going to take significant time and effort to right this ship of American statecraft that is well off its keel right now.
How many
Um,
people have resigned their positions since you did, as far as you know, in this country, and not just in this country? You're in touch with people who've quit overseas.
yeah, that's right. So there are about 10 others who have publicly resigned over the last few months within the US government. There are, at least to my knowledge, at least double that who have resigned privately. In other words, they've said, I don't want to be a part of this. I'm not going to make a hue and cry. I don't want to be a public face, but I'm not doing this anymore, and have just left quietly. To some extent, at least, that's also been the case in other countries. I know that in the Dutch government, for example, Angelique Ape, who was a foreign ministry official, resigned in November over this. I was in the Netherlands, in The Hague, back in January, where Dutch civil servants have been conducting weekly sit-ins outside their own foreign ministry in protest at the Netherlands' policies. And there's certainly been significant protests in other US partners around the world as well.
And I mentioned that uncommitted vote. That was something that you supported. You might want to talk about your decision to do that. We're in an election cycle. Do you have reason to believe that the protests that took that form and then the other protests in the streets have actually made a difference inside the US White House?
So let me be clear that I think when it comes to the underlying policy, I don't think that that has changed significantly or substantively in the last 8 months. There has been a change in tone, and that is not entirely unimportant. And I think that change of tone is greatly attributable, particularly to the uncommitted vote movement.
Yeah.
I think the Biden re-election campaign still has not got its arms around the scope of the problem they are facing. I think that their theory of the case is still that when it comes to November, people will look at a choice between Biden and Trump and come back, as it were, to Biden. But at the same time, I think they recognize, certainly in some states, that there is a significant issue for them, and that has prompted, a greater degree of community engagement, a change in some tone, and of course, I think there's also been a growing frustration with Prime Minister Netanyahu in particular. But again, I think this has all been mostly for show, as it were, rather than a substantive shift at this point.
Yeah, because the arms sales continue. And in your view, many of these are flat out in violation of US and even international law at this point. Do you want to just remind our audience what the laws supposedly are that you were trying to uphold before you quit and that caused you, in effect, to make the decision that you did?
Yes, certainly. So there's policy and there's law, and I'll just touch very quickly on because it's interesting. So the US provides arms to countries overseas uh, through either government to government transfers or through commercial export licenses, and some of those transfers are funded by you, the US taxpayer. Um, the human rights conditionality in law that relates to arms transfers, by and large, attaches itself to the funding, not to the transfer. So you'd be surprised how few laws are actually on the book that prohibit arms transfers themselves to countries that are violating human rights or international law. But so what covers most of the arms transfers, if the country themselves is funding it, is the conventional arms transfer policy. President Biden's conventional arms transfer policy says that the transfer of weapons shall not be authorized if it is more likely than not that those weapons will be used to violate international law, contribute to the risk of violations of international law, or indeed contribute to the risk of violence against children. I think it is looking at what we see in Gaza, very, very hard to argue, yet the Biden administration does, but very hard to argue that the arms we have been transferring to Israel over these past 8 months have not caused immense harm to children and violated international law. Yet the Biden administration's current interpretation of or application of that policy is that it is indeed not more likely than not that they are doing so. So that is deeply problematic. On the security assistance side, on the funding side, first of all, there is, of course, the Leahy laws, which say that we cannot provide security assistance to a unit that is credibly alleged to be involved or to have committed gross violations of human rights. I think we can see myriad examples in Gaza of gross violations of human rights. We've also seen those historically, well before 2000, before last year. In the West Bank in particular, there were multiple incidents of multiple units, of which I know for a fact that the State Department was in receipt of credible allegations of gross violations of human rights, and yet did not take the required legal action to prohibit assistance to those units. In fact, we have a completely different system for assessing Israel than we do for the rest of the world when it comes to these, and that system has never resulted in an Israeli unit being denied access to US-funded, taxpayer-funded arms. The other law I want to quickly point out is known as Section 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act, or it is Section 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act, and it says specifically that if the president is made aware that a foreign country is restricting the delivery of US-funded humanitarian assistance, that country cannot receive US assistance of any sort. This is something that, if you've seen the news recently, one of those resignees that we just mentioned, a lady called Stacey Gilbert, who resigned from the State Department about 2 weeks ago, had been working on a report that the Biden administration submitted to Congress. One element of the report was the question, is Israel restricting humanitarian assistance? And she, as the subject matter expert, had been drafting a response to that said yes, because as we can all very visibly see, Israel is indeed restricting humanitarian assistance to Gaza, including US-funded assistance. At the very last minute, the pen was taken off her, the report was taken out of her hands, and she didn't see it again until it was published, at which point she went to look at it and saw that the report says that Israel is not restricting US-funded humanitarian assistance. So someone at a very senior political level rewrote the expert opinions to get around what would otherwise have triggered a restriction on assistance to Israel. So this is blatant illegality when it comes to the way that we are approaching our own laws when it comes to providing assistance to Israel in this context.
And I just have to ask you, did I see correctly in the Washington Post not so long ago that Biden was still uncertain whether war crimes were actually being committed by Israel? I mean, I did see the words war crimes and Israel in the same headline in a Washington Post article. I guess we should be glad about that, but uncertain?
Well, that's the word he used, right? I mean, if you recall, I think it was back in late December that he described Israel as committing indiscriminate bombing. Indiscriminate bombing is a war crime. So I'm not sure how uncertain he actually is. But I think what this administration has been doing, and I will have to say some of the lawyers working for this administration have been doing, is crafting language very carefully so as not to reach the sort of legal determination that would actually kick in any of these restrictions and stop the president from being able to provide the arms that he is doing to Israel.
All right. I have more questions, but I want to remind people to lift up their hands, use their digital question asking device if you have a question of Josh Paul. And I do want to make sure that we get a chance to get to your questions before I spend too much time on mine. I would just remind us that we're trying to find where the pressure points are for public pressure. And while we wait for questions, Josh, I have to ask you, where do you think those are at this moment? We've gone through the primaries, Joe Biden has enough primary delegates to get the nomination come August at the convention. We're well into campaign season, so public pressure on the uncommitted vote side changes its tone a little bit. We've seen campuses. We're going to hear from some people who've been involved in those protests, and there are lingering impacts for the students involved, but the campuses are out. Session is over for the spring season. They're out. Students are mostly home for the summer. A lot of the law that you have been busily focusing on your entire career seems to be going by the by. What do you think are the most useful pressure points for people like us?
Yeah, so I'll start again with that caution that this is going to be a marathon, not a sprint. This has been a deeply entrenched, for a number of reasons, some of them deeply political, set of policies for a long time, and they are not going to shift overnight. At the same time, I think we also have to recognize that we are pushing in the face of a very well-funded campaign from people who do not want the policy to change. In fact, want America to, provide even more arms and faster. And essentially, whatever Prime Minister Netanyahu says or does, smile, nod, and salute. So, I think we have to, first of all, just remember that context and set our expectations. I think, given where we are in the political season, there are a few things. I think, first of all, there are still, we may be through the primaries, but we are still coming very much into, let's not forget that the election is not only about the president, that there are going to be, 435 members of the House and, 34 members of the Senate up for election as well. And that, some of those primaries have not happened yet in the first place. And that, we do need to think about those campaigns as well and how we can continue to engage with any members of Congress who may be on the fence, or how we can support campaigns for candidates who might be supportive in this regard, who might care about humanity, who might care more about America's interests around the world than I think many of those currently in Congress are demonstrating that they do. So first of all, let's continue to engage with the congressional level. I think that's very important, and I think will remain important in the longer term. I think there are also, and this is perhaps more on the activist side, but I think we've seen a lot of protests directed against the very, very senior levels of government, against the president, against Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin, and the same with litigation. There is the Center for Constitutional Rights case that is seeking an injunction on arms transfers to Israel in the context of the Genocide Convention and America's obligations there, which is suing, again, that's the president, Secretary Austin, Secretary Blinken. I think that there is value in looking a bit lower. I think that there are many senior officials, particularly political appointees, at levels below that, who do not want to be the face of a genocide, who did not go into government for this reason, but are happy to keep working on it so long as their name stays out of the media, so long as they are not the one receiving, letters from the public, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, lowering, the focus, as it were, a bit further down into the administration, that the folks who are actually making this happen, or who are actually delivering the president's goals on a day-to-day basis, is another helpful aspect.
Very helpful. And always helpful is Phyllis Bennis from the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington. I thought you might have a few thoughts on this, Phyllis. Thanks for raising your hand.
Thanks, Laura. And really thanks, Josh, for great information and for what you've done. This is important. This is important, being on this side of history. So thank you for all of that. I wanted to ask some follow-up on this question of particularly the issue of the Uncommitted campaign. People that I've talked to in DC seem to think that this is very much a one-man show right now, that it wasn't always, and certainly US policy towards Israel is nothing like a one-man show. But on this issue of continuing to provide military aid to Israel throughout the accusations of genocide, this is Biden's decision. And that his people, the people that are in the room, apparently are divided. Some of them actually agree. Some of them, as you say, do not agree. Apparently, some of them have raised problems publicly with him, not publicly, but directly to him. When he refused at a certain point, people stop asking because they realize it's futile at that point. But here's my question. Assuming that that's true, that the uncommitted vote has been the single most influential component of our wide movement so far in actually influencing the administration, Biden has made certain small changes, mainly in language. He did stop one shipment of arms, of those horrific 2,000 pound bombs. But as you say, he has not changed the policy. That's the key thing. So my question is this. A lot of people are asking, when we finish, there's one sort of set of primaries left. When that's over, then we're faced with preparation for an election. I also work for a nonprofit. I don't say, who people should vote for or who they shouldn't vote for, but just looking at the situation, it does seem that the question a lot of people are asking is, how do we convince people who say they can't vote for Biden because he's enabling genocide? How do we convince them to vote for Biden anyway? Because the alternative is inevitably going to be worse.
I wasn't sure that was where you were going, but
yeah,
Josh,
no, that's a real question. I happen to think that's the wrong question, but that is a question a lot of people are asking. And I think it's the wrong question, one, because answer it however you want. It ain't going to work, in my view. I don't think anybody's going to be persuaded by simply good logic or something. But I think the right question is, how do we get Biden to change his position so no one is faced with having to vote for someone who they can't vote for because he's enabling genocide, right? So we come back to this question of what else could work? What could replace the uncommitted process, which now is brought in, by my count, it's somewhere about 675,000 people across the country have voted uncommitted, or voted Gaza, or voted whatever form it takes. So the question is, that's the right question. How do we answer that?
What's the next vehicle for this kind of electoral pressure? Josh, what do you think?
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you, Phyllis. And, I think you've been a strong voice on these issues for a while. I recall, it must have been several years ago, but hearing you on NPR speaking about US arms deliveries to Israel during a previous Gaza conflict.
Very successful, clearly.
So here's where I am on that question. First of all, at the presidential vote level, I am not going to look a Palestinian American who has lost, and I've met some of these people who have lost 60, 90, 110 members of their family in Gaza. I'm not going to look them in the eye and say you must vote for President Biden. Can't do it. But I don't think the question is necessarily how do we convince people. I also don't know that it's how do we convince President Biden. I think it's how do we change American policy.
Right.
And to my mind, that frames the question of this election it's not about two men. It's not about Biden versus Trump. It's about, do you want an America where the democratic process exists, where there is hope for change, where if we work hard enough, long enough, as heartbreaking as it is, as painful as it is, we have a system where our voices can win out? Or do you want a process where the democratic system is not effective, where the voice of the people are not effective, where you may get lucky once or twice on policy issues, but it won't be because of anything that you can really control. It will be because there is a small oligarchical circle at the top who are doing whatever they like. I think, frankly, that's the choice before us here. And so I am not convinced that President Biden himself is convincible, but I am convinced that America is convincible, that America can change and that we can do better. And so that's, I think, the answer, and that's the America that I'll be supporting.
There's also that question of international law and the whole structure of international law that is challenged here. And we can come back to that in a sec. But I did want, and we have some questions coming in the chat. Again, raise your hand if you want to participate and ask Josh a question directly. I did wonder, you said, there are lower ranking members of the administration and local officials who may not want to be the face of genocide. What about people working for companies that may have exposure to being accused of being responsible or playing a role in genocide? Obviously, arms manufacturers are perhaps not going to listen to us, but they're in the business perhaps. But is there avenues there as universities and others think about divesting, and as lawyers perhaps bring lawsuits around responsibility for genocide?
Yes, absolutely. I think part of the problem we face here in, influencing decision-making both within government and within companies is that we don't have a great track record of accountability. It is extraordinarily rare for anyone, particularly from the West, to be brought to trial, let alone convicted, or for that matter, face any sort of civil suit or lose any money for supporting war crimes, whether that is a wrench turner on the factory floor where they make those 2,000-pound bombs, or whether it is a senior official in the State Department who authorizes their transfer. There hasn't been to this point a great track record of that. And of course, what the United States is doing right now, amongst other things, is fighting tooth and nail to stop there from being such a record, right? Whether it be the Biden administration's stalwart opposition to the Center for Constitutional Rights trial or effort here in the United States, or whether it be our efforts to undermine the International Court of Justice and to threaten the International Criminal Court. So one can understand why, and I've talked to people in the State Department who've said to me, why should I care? The ICC isn't going to hold me accountable. I've literally had that conversation with people. So I think, there is a need to demonstrate that that is a possibility. I don't know how many people will be scared out of their jobs until we can show that these things are feasible. I think there's a third track here that actually might prove the most fruitful, which is, there are some crimes here that we're talking about for which there is universal jurisdiction under international law, some war crimes that you can be charged in any court. And if there is not an effective system here in the US to do that, because courts are unwilling to, rule against the administration or the government, the executive branch, if there is not an effective system in the International Criminal Court process because it is very slow and the US is undermining it, perhaps there is an effective system in the court of a country like Spain or Italy or South Africa or Brazil for that matter, or numerous other countries around the world. And I do suspect that we will start to see cases brought in those countries against US officials by name and perhaps against US defense companies, including their CEOs by name. And those people might find that they cannot any longer go on holiday to Europe. Now that's not the the worst thing that can happen to a person, but it is a beginning. And I think that that's the path that this is probably going to take.
Yeah. I want to catch up on what's happening on some of the campuses in just a second, if Chenjerai is willing to talk about that. But before we do, we had a question from a woman who I would love to actually come on camera. I wish you would, Judy Balaban, wherever you are, because Judy's one of those who in this little state, this little county of Sullivan County here in upstate New York, has been engaging community members in conversation about contentious issues. And just this week held a conversation about this very topic. Hey, Judy. I would love to hear, you have a good question for Josh, but I would also love to hear from you what came up in that conversation, because just simply trying to engage people in this discussion seems like one of the things we can do and maybe need to get better at. So Judy Balaban, thanks for joining us. Judy works with, among others, the Upper Delaware Action for a Free Palestine group that has formed recently in this part of the world. Judy.
Yeah, the Committee for Equity and Justice is the one that sponsors the conversations. And basically, we try to talk about very divisive topics. This, I think, has been the most divisive. And we start from a place of trying to understand where our perspective comes from. Is it your religion? Is it your upbringing? I personally am the child of Holocaust survivors, and and that can be taken in many different ways. I mean, what I learned from that is I have a responsibility to everyone because we breathe the same air. And if people had felt that way before, things would have turned out differently. So most of the people that came on Thursday were from the Upper Delaware Action for Free Palestine. And there were a few people there who were very pro-Israel. And, we went around just trying to understand where our perspectives came from. And, I think that worked well. But then people started getting a little bit contentious. And that was to be expected. And, you know, conflict is not necessarily bad, as long as we can respectfully address it. And I'm not sure that we were able to do that at the time. But I know that we will continue the conversation. Not sure if we will be going to examine the facts, because what many of us understand are facts are all dependent upon, you know, where you're getting your information. And that in its and of itself is a very interesting process. And we've done that in other discussions we've had on immigration and gun safety, and you know, and that was very eye-opening.
Yeah. Now, you did have a good question for Josh. I don't want you to forget
Yeah,
it.
so I was interested in knowing if there had been any conversation about just providing Israel with defensive weapons. I think Bernie Sanders had this idea, and you know, supporting the Iron Dome and cutting off any offensive weapons.
Thanks,
Yeah, I mean, so certainly that's actually a position that I would endorse. So, you know, we do provide Israel, first of all, with about $500 million a year in Defense Department support, and that's before we talk about the recent supplemental that passed that provides several $billion, but that is just for, you know, air and missile defenses. On top of which, Israel is free to use its own money to buy, you know, as many, you know, air defenses as it likes from us. It's done that during the course of this conflict. You know, my theory of the case is that I think civilians should not have to live under the fear of bombardment, whether that is from rockets as they sit in, you know, their houses in Sderot or wherever, or whether that is in the case of Palestinians sitting in their apartments in Gaza. So I have, you know, no objection whatsoever to that approach. It is one, as you say, that Senator Sanders has also endorsed, that, you know, let's keep giving them defensive support, but not the lethal arms that are resulting in so much harm in Gaza. I think, you know, the problem is it's just not going to take off. There just isn't the broad. The problem is not that there is disagreement about whether or not we should give Israel defensive equipment and air defense. The problem is that there is still a large majority in Congress, let alone in this administration, who believe that we should keep giving Israel the lethal weapons that it is using in Gaza. You know, right now, for example, there have been, I think it's up to 78 members of Congress now who've called for a ceasefire, for a permanent ceasefire. And that's not nothing. I mean, that's far, far more than in any, you know, conflict with Israel in the last 30 years. But it's still about 15% of Congress.
Yeah.
And I think of that remainder, you will find the large majority strongly support continuing to flow lethal arms. So I think, you know, if we can ever get there, I think that's probably what the right answer is going to be, is that, yes, there should be defenses. Civilians should not be defenseless against attacks. But we do not have to, you know, provide the weapons that are killing civilians. I just think that we're a long way off from getting to that balance.
Thanks for that. I do want to bring on Chenjerai Cohen Kika, who is teaches at NYU and has been very involved in the protests there on campus. I'd love to hear from you where you think those protests stand, what happens now, and, you know, how are you? Are you all right?
Yes. Well, first of all, I want to just thank you for this really educational conversation. I've been furiously scribbling notes, which I will certainly relay to my colleagues, and so thank you. Yeah, it's been quite a time over the last few months on campuses, and you know, I'm here at NYU, but of course, very shortly after the Columbia encampment went up, you know, campuses across New York City were in contact, and there's even contact among campuses across the country. So I would say a few quick things, and you know, is that where we're at right now is that, you know, most students have left campus, but there is, and after the students have left campus, the universities have chosen to kind of really tighten the disciplinary apparatus and come down on them with various ways, most of which can't really sustain scrutiny, like the charges that they're launching, because most of these protests have been peaceful. So there's that kind of thing. And I think that they're banking on the fact that students will come back in the fall and not protest, but nothing that I've seen over the last months indicates that that's the case. And I think that speaks to a few things to talk about what has been accomplished. You know, a few things that have been accomplished is, I mean, what we saw on this campus, and I think really across the country, was a tremendous amount of people be educated about the issue of, Israel's occupation of Palestine in general, and in particular, the conditions in Gaza. And then, just this, because for so long, a big part of the the Zionist project has been to prevent people from asking the critical questions and having a good faith conversation or educational process, right? The minute you raise certain kinds of question, you're deemed to either be a terrorist yourself, in support of terrorist, or anti-Semitic, or all of the above. And that, for that sort of to lift on the college campus and let the university do what it's supposed to do has been amazing. So we've seen the formation of a group called Faculty for Justice in Palestine. NYU, I believe, was the first active, one of the first active chapters at least. And it's now been expanded to Faculty and Staff for Justice in Palestine on many campuses. It's now, there's over, I don't even know how many, I think there's certainly over 90 chapters in the country now. And in the case of the new school, those faculty, once the student encampment ended, they started their own encampment. So I think one other thing I would say is that this has been, I think, an occasion for people to really understand what a university is from a financial and material perspective, right? When you start to have to see whether you're politicized around the issues of Palestine or not, that your university is willing to call the police in to violently subdue students and faculty who are peacefully protesting, then you start to say, well, wait a minute, we're just simply we're paying tremendous tuition, right? So many of these students are going into lifelong debt to pay tuition. They have a right to ask how that tuition is being spent, and the extent to which that's supporting, defense, weapons research. The University of Tel Aviv, NYU Tel Aviv, for example, has tremendous investments in ways that they're involved in what's happening in Gaza.
Yeah.
So I just think that, like, in all those ways, it's been effective. But I do think that I'm paying very close attention to the question you're asking. Like, while all of this is important and it's a step forward, how does it translate into a real pressure point that could end this?
Yeah.
I mean, I just want to say on that, in the course of the last few months, I've gone to at least a dozen colleges and universities around the country to, speak with students and all that sort of thing. And everyone I go to, I ask the faculty member who's moderating the talk, or, who's hosting the dinner, or whatever it might be, how's it going here? What's going on here? And in every single case, they have said to me some version of, the students are not the problem. The students are here to learn. They are happy to talk to each other, even when they disagree. When they protest, it's peaceful. The problem is, as soon as they start speaking up, and as soon as it gets anyone's attention, the calls start coming in from the trustees and from the alumni. And that's where the problem is. And so I think you've hit the nail on the head there when you say how much has been illuminated about how the spirit of our academic system, of our educational system, has been hijacked by money, and is now being used to crack down on students. I was in Dartmouth College myself when the crackdown there started, and the bunch of kids sitting on the lawn singing peace songs, and here come the police with their batons and riot gear. It was shocking. So yeah, I mean, I'm fully with you on that. I think it has highlighted that disconnect, and I think it has, become an issue. One of the kids in the classroom in Dartmouth, where I was giving a talk, actually, said to me and said to the whole class, he was, a 20-year-old kid, looked like a bit of a jock, and said, I don't really care about this issue, and I think the protesters are probably, wasting their time. But when you start arresting my friends, you can bet I'm going to show up the next night. And so I think it has, energized a generation of students in a way that will very much backfire. I think, if they had just ignored the protests and let the students sit there in their encampments, and, the semester would have ended and everyone would have, moved on. So I think the approach they took was ultimately deeply counterproductive for their own goals, assuming that their own goals were about addressing the students' concerns and the protests on campus, and not demonstrating to their trustees, look, I'm taking a tough stand and you can keep giving money to the college. And I think that's the problem that this has all highlighted. I think that you're right, the encampments, the protests will carry on for as long as, certainly for as long as Gaza carries on, and Israel seems to be insistent that it will, be continuing these operations for several months to come. So we'll see what the fall brings. And of
Now, what
course,
about
let me just also note very quickly on that, though, that I think let's also remember that Prime Minister Netanyahu would be delighted if President Trump got reelected.
Sure.
And I think it's also in his interest to see this disruption in America and this chaos in the college universities that, people can then point to and say, Biden is weak on law and order and all this stuff. And so I think that's another calculation that we have to take into account.
Well, we're talking about campuses for a second. There are several, Union Theological Seminary being one, but there are several others that have agreed to student demands, at least for transparency as to where their portfolio is invested, their investments sit.
Well, right. I mean, let's remember Rutgers
Is there an
University
opportunity
in New
that we
Jersey.
could? Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, let's remember Rutgers University in New Jersey. That was one of the colleges that did sit down with the students, come up with a reasonable list of here are the things we're willing to do, here are the things we're not willing to do. And then the president of Rutgers gets called in front of college, in front of in front of Congress, and accused of unfair compromises and legitimizing Hamas. So there's a trap there.
Well, yes, but I still hold out hope that there's going to be somebody that's scrutinizing some, stock holdings at some point. And I wonder if you have advice to them. We talked about arms manufacturers. That's kind of obvious. But isn't there other support that is going to Israel in the conduct of this assault on Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank that could bring some exposure? I'm thinking of tech firms, of surveillance, communications equipment. I mean, there's all sorts of companies that have been involved in, for example, some of the, geo-assisting of the Israeli raid on Rafah not so long ago. I'm just trying to, again, in my desperate search for pressure points, is there one there?
Yeah, I mean, I think
part of the issue. What about Google?
Well, right. So for example, that we know that there has been a significant role for the AI tech sector for the American tech sector rather in some of Israel's use of AI, which we know that it has used in its targeting to generate targets, to strike targets, through something. For example, the Israeli Defense Forces relies on a cloud service run by Google and Amazon Web Services, Project Nimbus. And you now have a movement out of those companies called No Tech for Apartheid. Actually, it predates last October, but has significantly expanded. Trying to push back from within the companies on these issues, and you've, as a result, now seen a significant number of employees fired from these companies for exercising their free speech rights, including people just in the last few days from I'm trying to remember the other company, from Oracle and from Apple as well, I think it was recently. So, that's certainly part of the issue. I think there are ways that we can try to get at this from the outside. For example, certainly for publicly traded companies, to try and raise these in ESG forums, environmental, society, and governance forums, or through annual shareholder meetings, to try and put forward resolutions if there's an opportunity to do so and to get them through the corporate governance. That's for publicly held companies. I think there's probably greater leverage afforded through the shareholding process than there is through a boycott process. And I'm not taking a position one way or the other, but it's very hard to boycott Google. I mean, you try not using Google products. So I think we have to be smart about this and targeted. I think where there is a specific concern, a specific message, and we can get a large number of people to band together on a specific campaign, that makes sense. But I think, just looking across the board and saying, well, everything that touches this, we shouldn't touch with our own money, with our own investment, I think sounds great in theory. But once you start pulling apart all the overlapping pieces, it's very difficult to do.
Pretty difficult. All right, we've got about a quarter of an hour left. Sylvia Schwartz has a question. Hi, Sylvia.
Hi. This question might be more for you, Laura, than Josh. And it seems to me that no matter how much we get our news from you and other and other media, most people get their news from MSNBC and Fox News and so on, and those media outlets have been horrible. How do we get those to change?
Good frigging question. Well, one thing is to communicate with people you think are doing good work and people that you think are doing horrible work. So there are some people out there doing their best, I think, and they should be commended, not just to them, but to the people that employ them. And then I mean, it doesn't hurt to communicate, to comment, to critique. I agree. I think a boycott is rough if it's not carefully organized, if it's not really strategic. But I would also say don't rely on the networks for your coverage, for your attention. And that's why we're trying to provide some alternatives. I know that this is a sort of very pathetic answer to your very important question, but hey, I gave up and started, I've been doing my own for so long that I'm actually cheered to see even as much reporting as there is, because it's so much more than there was when I started out 30 years ago. Started out with people like Phyllis Bennis at WBAI, Pacifica Radio in New York. I do think there's been some progress, but maybe that's me just seeing sort of glass a teeny tiny bit full. Phyllis, I know that you've got another question. Maybe you've got some thoughts on how the heck we change the media.
Yeah, it's a huge question and an important one. And I do think it is important to recognize what Laura was just saying. The shift that has happened, if we go back 20 years, it's astonishing. If we go back 10 years, it's huge. If we go back 5 years, it's pretty big. And if we go back 8.5 months, it comes back to astonishing. It's still terrible. What you just said about the mainstream media, it's still terrible. But compared to what it once was, it's night and day. And it's our movement that made that possible. It's our movement that made it happen. So I think that is really important. And it goes to something that was sort of the question / comment I was going to have to raise with both Laura and Josh, which goes to this issue of the justice generation. This generation that came of age politically in the summer of 2020, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, and suddenly we're growing up seeing the issue of Palestine not as a kind of foreign policy question over there somewhere that might be relevant if you're Jewish or if you're a Palestinian, but otherwise is not all that relevant. All of a sudden, it's being seen as a racial justice issue.
Yeah.
And that's a huge shift. It makes it so different. A friend of mine I was talking to recently was talking about his kids who are in college now. I think they're 21 and 23, something like that. And he said, my kids are more committed to and connected to Palestine than I ever was to the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. And they know more about Palestine than I ever knew about South Africa. And I knew a lot about South Africa. This was somebody who was very central in the South African anti-apartheid era. And he's saying, his kids are like light years ahead. What I was struck by is that on the one hand, we've seen both in the campus encampments and all the work on campuses, but also all the giant national mobilizations that have happened every couple of months in DC, all of the smaller local mobilizations that are happening on a daily basis all over the country. There's an incredible level of message discipline. People have stuck to the issue. This is about a ceasefire now. And that's made it possible to bring in all kinds of people. But at the same time, we've seen a broadening and a deepening of what it means to call for a ceasefire.
Yeah.
So right now, when people say ceasefire now, it doesn't just mean a temporary pause. It means immediate and permanent. And it means not only stop firing an actual ceasefire, but it means, number 2, massive humanitarian aid having access and start funding UNRWA again. We can talk about why UNRWA is particularly important. Aside from the broad issue of aid in general, UNRWA has a very specific importance. Yeah. But then there's the third thing, which goes to the question of stop sending the weapons.
Yeah.
And all of that is wrapped up when people say ceasefire now. And when you talk to people from all over the country who understand that kind of instinctively, it's not like we did a leaflet and sent it out and everybody got the memo. Oh, from now on, ceasefire now means X, Y, and Z. It's just people absorbed it. They're sharing with each other. They're talking to each other. The campus activists are talking to other campus activists. The folks that were sitting in Congress, when we had the 80 executive directors of organizations that have nothing to do with Palestine sitting in Congress, they were absorbing all this stuff from the few Palestinians they spoke to.
And
that's
we
what
haven't
we
even
need to
talked
do.
about the unions, which has also been night and
Yes.
day from the
Look what
past.
happened
I
in
want to
Oakland.
just
Look what
bring
happened
Josh
in
back in
Oakland.
for a
Yeah.
second, Phil, or both of you could answer this, but I want to bring Josh in because we've mentioned now aid, we've mentioned ceasefire, and we've mentioned Netanyahu. Can you tell us what's the significance of what we're hearing as we talk today, which is that the Israelis have announced some sort of pause on bombardments during the daytimes in Rafah so that aid can enter, and then from UNRWA saying there's no change at all. I mean, Josh, what do you know to be true, and what is the significance of Netanyahu's dissolving of his war cabinet? Does this mean he's weaker or stronger?
So on the humanitarian assistance piece, I think first of all, we've seen this play out before, right? There was a Israeli agreement several weeks ago to let in significantly more trucks, and Israel turned around and said, look, we've let in 400 trucks today, and UNRWA said, yes, but you're only letting them come in with 50% capacity. So I think we have to be extremely skeptical. That said, I think Israel recognizes, look, I mean, since they took over the Rafah crossing with Egypt, there's been essentially a full stop on humanitarian assistance of any kind going into Gaza. And we are now on the precipice of a famine and a real starvation that could kill many thousands. And I think Israel realizes what that would look like, what that would be. And it's had a policy for many, many years of providing Gaza with just below really what it needs to subsist on. Right? I mean, this has been an official Israeli policy, is that you keep it running at the very, very minimum possible. And I think that's what they'll try to do. So I don't know that there's been an increase in humanitarian assistance getting through in the last 24 hours. I suspect that it will go in waves, and we'll see some increases in trucks getting through, and just enough to stop the entire population slipping into starvation, and then the strikes will resume, and then the trucks will resume, and this will continue to play out for months, or I should warn you, possibly for years. So I think that's the situation we're in, and that's going to become more the status quo. On Netanyahu's current situation, with regards to the war cabinet, with Gantz's withdrawal, I mean, the war cabinet is not the ruling government of Israel. It was a alliance put together to try and create an impression of unity. At the end of the day, my grandmother used to say, my Irish grandmother used to say about someone that you could flush them down the toilet and they'd come up covered in gold. And I think that's Netanyahu, to be honest. I think he's a very canny politician, and I would never underestimate his ability to survive and to do whatever it takes to survive, no matter the cost to Israel, to America, or to the Palestinians.
We're running out of time, and Phyllis, I'm going to have to call you up and get your take on all of that as well. But I do want to go back to the media question for a second, because what you've just said is super sobering, Josh. And one of the things we know is that in our consolidated monopoly media system, more about money than about much else, we see basically one topic a day, if we're lucky, sometimes one topic a week. And if this conflict continues, if this assault continues, we'll see less and less attention being paid to it. This is truly one of the great examples of why we need independent media that isn't dependent on ad dollars, isn't underwritten by the same companies that bring us war, and that survives thanks to the support of its donors. So I want to thank everybody who's supported us over the many, many years to do the work that we do. And I want to bring on for a second my ally in independent media, somebody who also has her own independent show, also talks about this topic, and has also experienced what it's like to be censored for her views on this very question. And that's Katie Halper. Katie, you've been with us in this hour quietly. I know that you have a lot to say, but I just want to give you a shout out and thank you for your work. And I understand you're going to be talking with Josh soon.
Yeah, thanks so much, Laura, and thanks so much, Josh. This is great. And yeah, Josh, you're going to be coming on to my show. Very excited. 2 weeks from tomorrow. And I just want to thank everyone for this really informative discussion. And also thank you, Josh, for your bravery. And Laura, thank you for your steadfastness on this issue. And it is really inspiring to see that independent media is, in some cases, even pushing corporate media to talk about certain stories, or pushing corporate media to debunk certain stories. So that's really encouraging. And Josh, another thing I want to thank you for talking about was that haunting story you told about the State Department finding a credible case of sexual assault committed against a young boy, which Israel responded to by shutting down the charity that brought that case forward. And I think it's so important because we know how much sexual violence has been, or the claims of sexual violence have been used to justify what's happening in Gaza. So thank you for talking about that.
You've had your own
Also,
experience of being censored, Katie. Have you got a sense of how many people have found themselves without a position, without a job, because of their views on this?
well, yeah, so I was fired from the Hill 2 years ago, and just literally last week, Brianna Joy Gray, who was full-time at the Hill, was also fired over her criticisms of Israel. So even a place like the Hill, which fancies itself or claims to be a place where you can talk about things that corporate media doesn't allow you to talk about, that's kind of their shtick. It's obviously more of a marketing issue. But it is interesting that on other issues, they really are allowed to go outside of the confines of corporate media, but this is the one issue where they can't. So, yeah.
So Josh, I'd have you conclude for us, if you would. I mean, we have questions in the chat from people saying, I'm not a university student, I'm not an investor, I'm not a shareholder. What do I do today? What can I do? You saying it's a long struggle, but people are dying today. What's the best, most useful thing for us to imagine perhaps doing today and perhaps keeping up in the long term?
Yeah, I think it is a long struggle, but I think it is important to keep raising your voices. I think at the end of the day, as much as we have a policy problem here, what we actually have is a political problem. And it's going to take a continuous chipping away at the politics. I'm working with some folks on an initiative we'll be rolling out in that space in the coming weeks. But there's plenty of opportunities from the local level, from calling for ceasefire resolutions, which do matter, even in local towns, because they filter up to your state senate, to your local federal members of Congress, who are aware of what's happening in their districts, to thinking about how you vote, how you persuade others to vote. The other two things I would say is networking, building those networks of like-minded people within your own area. You might work in the postal service, you might work in a factory, you might work in the tech sector, but finding others, whether it be in your community, in your work community, in your faith community, who cooperate. We are all stronger when we speak together and when we find different ways to interact through each other's own specialties and capabilities. And then the final thing I would say is self-care. No one is any use to anyone else if they themselves are falling apart. And there's a lot of pain and suffering that I think we are all experiencing, both vicariously and directly. And I think making sure that we are at our strongest so that we can raise those around us and that we can raise our voices for those in Palestine is really the starting point for anything that follows.
All right. Well, with that, I'm going to go and get some breakfast. No, just kidding. Thank you all. And thank you, Josh. Really, you kicked off, I think, an incredible display of bravery that we have seen from folks in public office around the country and the world over the last many months. I hope it increases. And I thank everybody that's joined us this afternoon and this evening, whatever time it is for you. You do make a difference. You make a difference to us, and you make a difference in the world. I've been very iffy about holding an event for donors around this question, and I hope that whatever you're contributing to us, you also contribute to the relief organization or empowerment organization for Palestinians and for peace in the Middle East and against militarism of your choice, of your choosing. You can make a regular contribution to UNRWA, which is, as we know, one of the best placed organizations for providing aid and has suffered a massive blow with the U.S. cutoff of support. You can find a conversation I did with Phyllis about UNRWA in our YouTube channel, and I think the link's been put in the chat. But again, happy Eid, folks. Thank you for your work, and we will convene again soon. Josh, Paul, thank you. Have a very good night.